Hi everyone and welcome back. Today I wanted to make a video a little different than the other ones I've made just because we've seen so much growth over the period of the World Cup with record sales, record attendance, and after the World Cup on a club level, we've seen record bids for players and record investment into the sport. And to truly appreciate and embrace this new future we're entering, it's only fitting to look back on the past, the events, the people who made this present possible. So today I'm going to be talking about the history of football in England and how women's soccer made it to how it is today. Let's get into it. So, the first question you have watching this is probably, where did it all begin? And while no one can definitively know that answer, people have traced some of the first discussions of women in soccer back to literature in the 16th century with people like Shakespeare, as well as a poem by Sir Philip Sidney called A Dialogue Between Two Shepherds, where he briefly has a scene with women playing soccer. In addition to this, there were people like Mary, Queen of Scots, who seems to have been a big spectator of sports and is thought to have possibly owned the first soccer ball. So, while the groundwork was laid in the 16th century literature, it wasn't until the 19th century when soccer really started to take off in England, and that aligned with the creation of the FA, or Football Association, in 1863. And that formalized the rules of the game, which brought in more players and more spectators. And that led to some of the first international matches. In 1881, England put together a team to play a series in Scotland, and the first match was a 3-0 win for Scotland, and that marked one of the first ever matches we know that's happened in women's soccer. At this point, it's fair to say that the popularity of soccer was rising exponentially, and with that, the turnout of women as both spectators and players rose too. And football clubs took advantage of this. In 1885, they started giving free admission to women in hopes that their presence would curb the more boisterous behavior of men in stadiums. And this worked spectacularly well. But then they realized that women generally wanted to come out to games, so even when they started charging for tickets, they could still keep their high turnouts. And through this engagement and popularity, the first women's clubs were founded. In 1894, the BLFC, or British Ladies Football Club, was founded by Nettie Honeyball. And when she was asked why she set up the team, she said, quote, "Why not? Aren't women as good as men? We ladies have too long borne the degradation of presumed inferiority to the other sex. The subject has been in my mind for years. If men can play football, so can women." And therefore, in 1895, the first public women's match was played in London with 11,000 fans coming out. And the popularity rose so much over the next few years that clubs like the BLFC managed to draw crowds higher than even record men's levels at the time. The next jump in the popularity of women's soccer would come around the beginning of the 20th century, and the context is twofold. The first is the men's 1915 FA Cup final, where there were several players banned after allegations of match fixing. The second was that the country was gearing up for World War I and recruitment processes were underway. Many players even thought that they could get their bans lifted if they represented their country. So many men were going away to war, which left women's soccer as the main pastime. During this time, the landscape of the country was changing. As more men went to war, ultimately ending the men's game at the time, more women were entering the workforce. And many factory owners saw soccer during lunch breaks as an opportunity to increase the productivity and health of their workers. This impelled the creation of many unsanctioned teams like the Bellas team, Blitz Spartans, and Carlisle Munitionists. In addition to this, one factory owner saw some of his workers playing football from his office, and he decided to create a team that would play for charity. They named the team after the factory's name, Dick Kerr's Ladies FC, and this team became one of the best teams at the time and the unofficial world champions. They even traveled internationally, gaining significant popularity. Their most famous player, Lily Parr, could draw crowds of over 45,000 people and became the first woman to be inducted into the National Football Museum's Hall of Fame in 2002. Even after men came back from the war, the popularity of the Dick Kerr's Ladies continued to grow. Even with the growing popularity, there was always a backdrop of hardship, this creeping belief that women should not play soccer, whether it's because it ruined their childbearing bodies or because it threatened the men's game. And this was formalized in December of 1921 when FA ruled, quote, "The game of football is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged." And this pretty much ended any professional endeavors as women's teams did not have the resources to continue. However, they were determined, and over 30 teams from across the country met in Liverpool that year to formalize the English Ladies Football Association, or ELFA, which aimed to popularize the game among girls and assist charity. And even though they lacked facilities, they continued to expand teams. For example, Percy Ashley, who was a scout for one of the men's teams, started a club so his daughter could play. It was called the Manchester Corinthians Ladies FC, and it became the most notable club and most successful of the time, winning over 50 trophies and raising over £275,000 for charity. However, this did not come without struggle. For example, they had to play in rugby stadiums and parks as they did not have facilities, and players often had to clean themselves in a local duck pond after matches because there was no running water in changing rooms. Even though they managed these ways to play over the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, it was unfeasible because the women's game could never grow. It became increasingly overshadowed by the men's game, which received all the funding and press. For decades, women had to suffer in the shadows before they could gain the forum they needed to have a discussion about women's soccer. This came in the mid-1960s after the English men won their first ever World Cup in 1966. This caused popularity to boom in the country. Women seized the opportunity and created the Women's Football Association in 1969. And over the next 2 years, they pushed the men's teams to allow women to play again. In the same year, they had their first ever National Cup competition called the Mitre Challenge Trophy that would eventually become what we know today as the FA Cup. Around this time as well, women were finally allowed back into the sports sphere. For example, Mary Rain in February of 1969 became the first woman to report on sports for BBC. Now that the ban had been lifted, women's soccer had the opportunity to grow on a professional level. But it wasn't until 1993 that FA resumed direct involvement in women's football. But stuff happened in the meantime. For example, the WFA, or Women's National League, was created, and that became the Women's Premier League in 1992 to parallel the equivalent top level in men's competition. Also at this time, many professional men's teams were affiliating with professional women's team, and that grew the sport as well. But the most important thing was in 2008 when the women's league system was transformed for a new level of top competition called the Women's Super League that persists today. They took the top 8 teams in the nation in one no relegation single division, hoping to gain greater exposure and funding into the game. While the WSL, or Women's Super League, had many problems in its early stages, such as financial troubles due to the 2007 global recession, it finally launched in 2011 and has since then expanded greatly. But that's for another video. So, we've gone all the way back to the 16th century with the first mentions of women's soccer, all the way to the current day with the creation of England's league, the WSL. And through all that history, we've not only learned of the perseverance and dedication that women have had to growing the game, even through hardship, but we also can answer critics who say that the women's game will never be as interesting or popular as the men's game. Ever since the ban in 1921, the women's game has not gotten as much appreciation, popularity, press, or investment. However, teams like the Dick Kerr's Ladies FC and the BLFC show that if they're given the stage, they can more than hold their own against the men's game. So, as we enter this new period of growth and a future in women's soccer, I have no doubt that this investment will change the way that people perceive women's soccer and will hopefully lead to much more prosperity and growth to come. Thank you for watching, and comment down below if you're interested in more videos about history on women's soccer.